Thank you, Anya, for that introduction. And hello, everybody, online and here in the Michael Cusack Centre. My name is Brian Nelson. I'm the invertebrate ecologist for National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Research Science Unit. So I'm going to give the first talk today, which is rather daunting, but it's going to be an overview of the Burren invertebrates, and hopefully we'll set the scene for the other talks, much more focused talks by the other speakers. So my talk is going to describe where and what is the Burren. That might seem a rather strange topic to have, but where and what is the Burren is important, and our audience may not understand exactly what the Burren is. It's a very complicated area. Then I'm going to talk about who, what, and why the discovery and recording of invertebrates, the people who have been involved in the history, and the history is not very long, as I will explain. Then we will talk about the current state of knowledge and gaps and questions, as Anya described, that we hopefully will address over the next couple of days. So, the Burren. If you look at the literature of the Burren, and there are an increasing number of books, including one by my brother, the Burren, the wildflower one, they keep emphasizing the unique flora that is internationally renowned. That's a statement that appears in lots of books. If you then look for information on the insects, and my own brother's book does not mention any insects as far as I can remember. I did plead with him to say something about the insects, but he refused. We then have this rather strange book, Flora, the Connemara and the Burren. I'm not quite sure why those two areas were ever linked together. They are so different. We have the New Naturalist volume of the Burren, which does actually quite have a lot about insects, but it's patchy. And we have books like Gordon Darcy's Breathing Burren, which is a very good book, but it's more of a sort of anthology of his thoughts and things. But it does mention lots about insects. But this statement, unique flora, internationally renowned. Hopefully, by the end of tomorrow, we will say unique fauna and flora that is internationally renowned. Because in my view, the fauna actually trumps the flora in many ways, and hopefully I will explain that through this talk. And the other people who are speaking will also give, from their own groups, why the fauna is so important and why we all come here to the Burren. So if you go back and look at the literature, and there's the very famous quote by, I think, one of Cromwell's generals. I'm not going to show that one. But I found this other one, and it's from a book by James Fraser in 1838. In those days, they always give these very grand titles. So, Guide Through Ireland, descriptive of the scenery, towns, seats, antiquities, etc., with various statistical tables, which I've actually not looked at. Also, an outline of its mineral structure and a brief view of its botany. It's rather strange. But basically, he described his travels through Ireland and wrote about things. And what he said about the Burren, you can read on screen, but I'll read out a few things. So the greater part of the Burren is different. So he recognised the Burren is very different from anywhere else in Ireland. Talks about the limestone, this great unbroken mass of limestone rock. I think he must have been around Blackhead, where he is, but anywhere in the Burren describes that. But the last bit, I think, is the most interesting. The most elevated parts are destitute of herbage and present to the eye an arid, cold, and joyless waste, unchanged by either summer's sun or winter's cold, and but little varied by either light or shade. That's a load of rubbish. Today, I know the online audience can't experience it, but we are here in the middle of what Ireland calls heat waves. And the Burren, in a hot, sunny day, is a very unforgiving place, but it is not cold and arid. Yes, there are no plants, but that often means that the insects take over, and absence of plants does not mean absence of insects. So, where and what is the Burren? So we're in this part of North Clare and southeast Galway, so that's often forgotten. Galway is a very strange county, and it goes all the way from Connemara right through to Gort. But southeast Galway has a lot of this karst landscape in it, and the karst landscape is the key aspect of the Burren. So the map on screen is the geological map, and the blue colours represent the limestone geology. The green colour then is the shale. So there's a shale layer which overlays the limestone in the south and comes up to Slieve Elva in the uplands. And then the limestone, as you go east, becomes covered increasingly by drift, and the karst runs out as you go east of Gort. There's still limestone there, but it's deep down. So the Burren is this central area of karst, and the name comes from this barony, which is an old political division created. Still has some uses, but basically has fallen out of use. But that is often taken as the definition of the Burren. But the Burren barony only covers the very far northern bit. Within this area that's on the map, 60% of the area is limestone pavement, this karst limestone. So that makes the Burren comparable in size to areas like Salisbury Plain, which I know is chalk, it's not karst, but also the karst areas of Sweden, the Baltic states, and Slovenia. Slovenia is where the name karst comes from, a region of Slovenia. And this dry limestone pavement with wetlands is found elsewhere in the world. But the Burren region, in Ireland, we often have habitats which are tiny little remnants. But what the Burren provides is a large block of habitat that, on an international scale, is as large as anywhere in Europe. So that's a very important thing that we have to recognise. Much of this area is over 200 metres high, but then as you go east, it becomes increasingly lowland. And again, that becomes an emphasis for the insects, this lowland nature of the eastern edge of the Burren towards Gort is an important, very important aspect. But it's often ignored by other groups, people doing other groups. And that's got numerous lakes and turlocks. And then within the Burren now, we have 1,500 hectares. That's the figure I could get off the web, but I think it might be a bit bigger than that, protected by the National Park. And national parks in Ireland are owned by the state, so that is actually state-owned land. So if you look at the Burren definitions that appear, the map on the left-hand side is the map that Webb came up with in a paper in 1962, where he was proposing that a lot of work should be done in the Burren. So this is the boundary he came up with. It roughly covers the barrenry area. I think that explains his boundary on the eastern side, which he never explained how he came up with that line. But it's a rather vague line to cover. The line on the south and the western side of the Burren is either the sea or the limestone boundary. The map on the top right is the map that the Burren Life Project used. And on that map, you can also see the green areas. The green areas are the SACs, the special areas of conservation that have been declared in the Burren. So the Burren Life Project covers most of the areas that the SACs cover, and has a boundary much further east than Webb, covering over to Gort and up to Ardrahan, where areas of karst still exist. But actually, there are areas of karst slightly outside that, and that's why I came up with a boundary which uses the limestone boundary, but then takes the new motorway from Gort, and the railway line forms to be a natural eastern boundary in terms of its physical. It's on the map, and it also includes a little area up in the northeast around Ardrahan and Castle Taylor that faunistically are basically like the Burren, and they have exposed limestone pavement. So depending on which group you're into, the boundaries vary, but Webb's boundary, I think, is too restrictive, because he really does keep out these interesting eastern areas. So early recording of insects. So if you go into the literature, and the literature of Irish insects is quite restricted. There are several papers, as I've explained, that basically cover groups. We've got to remember, back in 1900, there were railways, but there were no roads. There weren't no. So there were roads. There was no motor transport. So getting around Ireland was very, very difficult, but it is critical to some of the early history of the Burren. So, though there are plant records going back to 1600, I can find very few records of any insects from the Burren region, no matter what boundary you have, of pre-1900. But in July 1895, there was a meeting held in Galway of a group of field clubs. And this was a way that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of the recording was done. These field clubs would meet every 3 years. They picked an area, they based there for a week, and then they travelled around as best they could. So they stayed in Galway, and on Saturday the 13th of July, they left by boat from Galway to get to Ballyvaughan. And they described the morning as a morning of driving mist with great masses of vapour that still hung over the higher summits. So that tells you the sort of day that they were going to go to in the Burren, and not the day to go looking for insects. When they got to Ballyvaughan, they then went by foot west, which is the wrong direction. They went to Blackhead, and some of them even actually got up to the top of Glenina. So they did do a lot of work, but they saw virtually no insects in that time. They had to get back to Ballyvaughan at 5:30 to get a boat back. And that was the Burren covered. They spent the rest of the time in Connemara for some strange reason, because there were trains that could take them to places like Uachtarard and Recess. J. N. Halbert, who was a very prominent Irish entomologist, he never seems to have gone to the Burren after that trip. So that trip was his one, that I can find his one visit to the Burren was by Halbert, even though he was active up to the 1930s. So maybe the experience was so bad that he just didn't want to come back. And if you come to a Burren on a wet day, as the picture shows, it is an unforgiving and not very pleasant place. It's very difficult to walk around in, and insects just are not visible, and you get drenched. 1922 saw a significant event. That was the discovery of the pearl border fritillary. Two botanists were walking along the road to Cloncoose, and they saw these butterflies. It was in June. It was quite late in the flight season, but they said they were abundant. That's the first record of pearl border fritillary. And nobody really saw it afterwards for many decades. In 1924, another Irish entomologist, Stell Fox, spent July in County Clare, but as far as I know, apart from one visit to Cloncoose, which was in response to the finding of the pearl border fritillary, he spent most of his time in Lahinch. And Stell Fox was a hymenopterist mainly, but in his record, he for example, shows no sign that he doesn't record Bulbous sylvarum in the Burren, yet Cloncoose is a very good site to go and see that species. So this whole historical period, when a lot of records were being species added to the Irish list, the Burren seems to have been totally neglected. And I think one of the main reasons for that is the transport issue. There are no trains into the Burren. The trains go to Lahinch or they go to Gort, and then access, people didn't have cars, so access into the Burren period was really very hit and miss and difficult. So you go into 1950. Praeger, who is said to be the doyen of Irish botanists, and he was a very good botanist, he wrote this book, Natural History of Ireland, a sketch of its flora and fauna. And there's two quotes in that book which I think are unfortunate in the time and also unfortunate in what they say. He says the fauna of the Burren. He says the fauna not yet fully examined. So he does acknowledge that not many people looked at it. Offers little or remark. Now, as you'll see in a minute, that timing was extremely unfortunate, but so totally off the mark. I'm not sure why he ever said that. He also then went on about turlocks, and he said the animals of the turlocks have not been examined, which again, fair enough, but the abrupt changes in water level would not seem to be favourable to the presence of any varied or characteristic fauna. Well, that's actually the reason why they are. So he got it totally wrong, and I'm afraid, yeah, do not have botanists writing books where they don't have zoological input into them. Poor old Praeger. I don't. He was a very good botanist, I say, but he also did not seem to like the Burren. I think he preferred mountains and Connemara and alpine plants for some reason. And why his timing was so bad was because the year before, though he clearly didn't know it, this moth, the Burren green, was discovered totally by chance by he was an entomologist, Stuart Wright. He was down, I think, on a botanical trip. He was staying near Ballyvaughan. There are various stories about why somebody said he just jumped over a wall for a call of nature and he flushed this bright green moth that nobody had ever seen. He didn't know what it was, and it took a winter time of showing it to people in Britain before its name became known, which is the Burren green. It's now known. He wanted it called the clada, and that, for some reason, was never accepted. It's now generally called the Burren green in the literature. Calamia tridens is its scientific name. It is a common European moth of calcareous grasslands, never before seen in Britain or Ireland, and the Burren is the only region where it still is resident. So that came about just as Prager was publishing that book, and that then opened the floodgates for recording. So very soon after that, moth recorders were coming over. In 1951, there was a big trip over. Webb himself, encouraged recording in the Burren. There was a British Ecological Society fund for a few years, and that funded people coming over. But then also in the late 60s, that was the era of a lot of research of habitats. People from Britain were coming over to look at the Burren to compare with calcareous grasslands elsewhere in Britain. And that has generated a lot of records. So here we have just a list of some of the names of people who have come over the years and the groups that they've looked at. And this really has I won't go through that list. You can see the list on the screen. But it covers the breadth of recording that has been done in groups has vastly expanded. So now we're in a much better position. But this really only started from that discovery of the Burren green. Did anybody ever see that moth before? I don't know. It's hard to imagine, but nobody had light traps and things yet. So, but it does fly during the day. But it's such a vivid green thing. You just wonder why did nobody ever see it before? And then, without Wright's discovery, how long would it have taken before it actually would have been refound? So, this just graphically demonstrates what the impact of that was. So this is I've got all the moth records from the Burren, and I just did this in a year chart. So this is the number of records per year of moths in the Moths Ireland data set. And you can see the little blips in the 1920s and the 1960s. That was the 1950s after the Burren green, there's that little blip. And then the 1960s, whenever the people started really coming over. And then from 1990 onwards with Irish-based recorders. And you can see, it's not year on year, but you can see the great increase in recording since then. So when it comes to the moth fauna, most of our records are from 1996, which makes it difficult to ascribe trends to species. And another group, the Heteroptera, which I do, which are the true bugs, just this showing that data in a similar sort of way. So there are 4 maps here. Top left is 1960 records, then 1960 to 1979, top right. And then on the bottom row on the left, 1980 to 1999 records, and then 2000. So each period there's an increase in the coverage of the groups, cumulative knowledge, but also slightly different emphasis about where recording was done. So in the 60 period, people concentrated on the western side of the Burren, and then increasingly we've been getting more records from the eastern side, which is in many ways the more interesting side of the Burren. But no group has got good comprehensive coverage. Every group needs more recording. Another way of looking at the data, this is the diversity of butterfly species in the Burren plotted on a 1K level. So you can see the redder the squares, the more species there are, up to 20, 25 species. And again, you can see that the emphasis is on the eastern Burren. That's where the diversity is highest. So there is high diversity up near Ballyvaughan, and on the far left, the area around Fanor is also a popular area for people to go recording. But most of the diversity is in the eastern lowland part of the Burren. Notable species, again, I won't go through the list, but notable species, I mentioned pearl border fritillary, the Burren green. Irish annulet is another species, which is a later discovery in 1991. A moth, again, that was never been seen in Britain and Ireland before and is restricted to the Burren. In dragonflies, again, the Burren has a lot of wetlands. Norman Moore came here in 1978 and found that the species called Leslie's dryas was particularly associated with the turlocs. It was apparently extinct in Britain at the time, but it's been rediscovered there since. But he came here and identified that the species actually needs the fact that turlocs dry out. Larvae grow in the wintertime. The adults emerge just as they're drying out. They lay eggs in the vegetation. They don't need water to lay eggs. And then when the water level rises, the eggs hatch and the growth starts again. So that exact reason that Prager said turlocs are not of any interest is why Leslie's dryas occurs here, and it's quite a large population. Irish damselfly was discovered as recently as 2011. That's quite a conspicuous species. Various species of diptera have been discovered in the Burren. Water beetles, ground beetles, bugs, and then another fauna which is either a groundwater fauna, which I'll come back to in a minute, or another species of turlocs, tanimastics, which potentially is one of the most interesting species, but has not been seen since the 1970s. If you look at the red-listed species, there are red lists for all these groups on the left, so bees, butterflies, dragonflies, etc. Eight insect groups have been red listed in Ireland. If you look at the proportion of the species that occur in the Burren, of the nearly 250 species of red listed invertebrates, almost exactly half occur in the Burren, and I give you there in the figures for each of the groups. So butterflies, 80% of the red listed butterflies occur in the Burren. The proportions for other groups are slightly less. Stoneflies, hardly surprising, there are no, because they're a running water species. But even mayflies are represented in the Burren, and 3 of the red-listed mayflies actually occur, and 1 actually is only known from the Burren region. So the number of red-listed species in the Burren is very, very high, and it covers all groups from terrestrial pollinators through to wetland species. There's a group of species in Ireland, in Britain and Ireland, which I call the Ireland-only species. And these are species that are only resident in Ireland and have no resident populations in Britain. And there's about 250 of these species. That figure might seem very high to people, but it includes about 60 species for which we have good data. That is probably the real distribution. And these 4 maps just show you the distribution, and I'll just emphasize the 2 in the top right. So on the left-hand side is the distribution of all the species of insect in that group, and then on the right it's the equivalent species for the maps. And you can see the 2 groups have a very different distribution. The Ireland-only insects are concentrated in the Burren. The Ireland-only plants are in these areas like Kerry and Connemara. There are some in the Burren, but it doesn't stand out as the highest diversity area. But the Burren is the single most important region. So that emphasizes the unique nature of the Burren for insects. And again, a frequent comment in other botanical books is that the Burren has this odd mixture of northern and southern species. Well, you can say exactly the same thing about the insects. In fact, it's even more remarkable in terms of the insects. So this is the European distribution of the Burren green, which occurs from Spain right up to southern Finland and occurs in the Burren. So that actually is a perfectly natural distribution. That's where you would expect the Burren to be climatically. Ireland is not out in extreme. So that's a species that the Burren is perfectly understandable why it's in the Burren. The Irish damselfly is a bit more of a northern species and occurs here in the Burren at its southern limit in Ireland, but it's mostly a northern species. So there's a more northern species that occurs in the Burren with the Burren green. The Irish annulet is a very southern species. The Burren plot isn't mapped there, but that's the map on the right-hand side. So the Irish annulet is a southern species, which the Burren is at its northern limit. There is a species of Cladoceran that occurs in the Turlock's Uri circus glacialis, occurs in the Burren at its very southern limit. So within the invertebrates, there are examples of all these distributions. So that comment about northern southern species being so remarkable in the Burren for the plants is actually equally true for the insects. So I want to finish just by saying, hopefully I've given you a brief overview of the insects, and the people speaking later will give a much more detailed one. But then we come to the issues that Anya touched on. With all this information we now have on the vertebrates, do our habitat definitions and our habitat management take into account the invertebrates? There's been a paucity of information up to now, but now we've got so much information that really we can't stand over and say, right, we need to take account of the invertebrates when we're looking at these habitats. So this is a random just brain dump from me, and it's not necessarily taken in any order. So there's a lot of emphasis on scrub increasing in the Burren, and it definitely was a problem, and you get this dense hazel scrub. But is that natural sparse scrub that occurs within the broken line, particularly on the eastern Burren? If you go on the eastern Burren, you see these little patches of vegetation. You've got these little patches of scrawny hazel scrub. Given that the Burren is a very windy and wet place, that to me is a key thing in providing shelter. It also takes account of the complex life cycles of insects. So insects over winter, so they need protection from grazing for that winter period. They need just habitat heterogeneity, because their life cycle may take in 2 or 3 aspects of the habitat. A plant just needs one, but i.e. the soil needs to be there. Insects move about. Bare ground is very important for insects, and again, that's why I think the Burren is so important, because it provides the heat, and in Ireland we need heat to get our insects active. They also need access to the soil, because that's maybe where they overwinter. So is winter grazing the best for invertebrates? It's removing all that vegetation at that time of year when the insects are dormant, but are you removing a lot of overwintering areas? Are there aspects of the fact that dung is only available really in the wintertime? Is it available in the summertime for that dung fauna? Wetlands, do they need to be grazed, and what time is the best time for insects to be, for the insects? Subterranean fauna, I barely touched that, but there is actually a group of species which probably are genuine Ice Age survivors. They went deep down into the groundwater, and only recently people have been looking at that, and there's 3 or 4 very interesting species of subterranean amphipods. Probably 3 endemic Irish species alone out of 4, and that's fauna that's only recently been recognised and needs to be looked at again. There are the Turlocks, drainage and enrichment. How is that impacting that fauna? There are the Marl Lakes, which, again, I've barely touched on. There are then poorly recorded groups, and this is where the irony of Halbert. Halbert actually was a water mite specialist, yet didn't seem to come to the Burren. Yet we know from his species list that they almost certainly occurred here. So again, the more data is needed on those species. So my last slide so I'll jump to my last slide. My last slide is that, in summary, I think we can say that the Burren, everything that you say about the plants, you can say about the insects. Most of the species are native. We don't need elaborate theories of how they got here. They flew. The habitat was here. They could get here. You didn't need to invent an Ice Age-free land off the west coast of Ireland for which there's absolutely no evidence it ever existed. A high proportion of the species, red-listed species, occur in the Burren. But we only have 1 protected species, and that's the marsh, and I haven't even mentioned the marsh artillery. And a majority of the species that are confined to Ireland, within Britain and Ireland, occur here in the Burren. We have genuine endemics. However, we still have many more to find. Dave Allen has gone around just this site and probably found species new to the site without any great effort. So there's an awful lot of work still needs to be done. What we have, however, is a robust ecosystem, little affected by introduced species, and that's something I think a point needs to be made. We should have a 0 tolerance of introduced species in the Burren. But we also have climate change. and climate change is driving change in an unpredictable way. So I'm going to end there, and thank you for listening, and I hope the rest of the talks elaborate on what I said, and at least I've provided a context for them, but thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Brian. So while you get I think we've about a minute and a half for questions, and there's one from John Breen online. He's wondering about the spread of red valerian in the Burren, and if you have any concerns. If anyone in the audience has any questions, stick your hand up, get a microphone to you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, John, and that's what I touched on at the end, that I think, yes, if we don't stop these species taking over, and red valerian is one that's most obvious, but we know from experience in Britain that cotoneasters are particularly damaging, and control at this earliest stage is the easiest thing to do. But yeah, we must keep a handle on those things, and as soon as possible.
Question here from the floor from Connor.
Just wondering about, you mentioned like there's probably a lot more invertebrates out there than we probably know. Has there been any analysis on like what percentage of like butterflies are likely undetected in the Burren or other things like that? Do we have has there been any kind of, like, I know the studies like that tend to be a bit kind of vague, but anything like that has been tried, or?
I understand your question, Connor. I have thought about that myself. But I think the Burren is so unusual that you know, something will come out of left field that you just don't understand. But yeah, it's a good point, and I think actually you could do it with the moths, and I have actually thought about that myself. Yeah, you could look at the Irish moth list and see what species are not in the Burren that you would expect from the plant, the fact that the food plant is here, etc., etc. It's an interesting thing. Yeah, it would be making an interesting actually project for a student. That one. That's a good point. And I don't know the answer.
About 5% on the moths. I reckon about 5% on the moths.
5%, according to Dave.